So, a lot was going on in terms of national politics and how that was affecting our national monuments and our natural environments. So, I had mentioned that I'd worked at Glen Canyon, which basically is a national recreation area administered by the National Park Service. I had worked at Glen Canyon, which sits directly in the middle of Grand Staircase Escalante and Bears Ears. With all of the things going on at the time, I decided to go back to my old stomping ground, back to what many refer to as the Canyon Country, that area of northern Arizona and southern Utah. Anyway, the plan was to go back to the Canyon Country, this area so close to my heart, the beloved Red Rock Canyons that I was so familiar with, having worked there both as a park ranger and as a wilderness river ranger. I decided that it was time to go back and do some investigating. And the timing was spring break, as it turns out, spring break of 2018. And one of the things that I suppose you should know is that even to this day, although so much of that area now has paved roads, much of the backcountry and both Grand Staircase Escalante and Bears Ears is still accessible only by dirt road. And I've always appreciated that. I've always thought that that's pretty cool because a lot of people just simply don't like to take dirt roads, and it means that there ideally will be less crowding in some of these very special places. So my plan was to do some field work over my spring break and take in as much as I possibly could over that period of time. You can kind of get a sense for what I did here. I visited Grand Staircase Escalante and Bears Ears, and I should mention my girlfriend, Vicky, was along with me. And then we went to the Navajo Tribal Park, one of the 5 sovereign tribes that has been affected by the national politics and the reduction of boundaries. We visited 7 different visitor centers and museums. We talked to BLM and USFS officials, and you'll recall from earlier class sessions, BLM stands for Bureau of Land Management, and USFS, of course, United States Forest Service. We talked to Native Americans about what was going on, as well as volunteers at these national monuments, hikers, people who were part of a nonprofit at Friends of Cedar Mesa, and then another nonprofit, the Grand Canyon Trust, a professor from Fort Lewis College in Colorado, who has a great deal of expertise about these lands, business owners in the area, and even townspeople. So I wanted to get as large a sense of what was going on as I possibly could. And as it turns out, actually, a month later, I was invited to a national conference in France, an international conference in France to discuss what was going on in terms of conservation issues in America. Well, our field work research here began with Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, and I mentioned that this area has some of the most remarkable fossil remains of dinosaurs found anywhere on Earth. And so here you can see Vicky's hand next to the footprint of a dinosaur. We, again, you can see the sign, Grand Staircase Escalante. We went to a fairly remote area after traveling a long distance on a dirt road to a place called Lick Wash. And I want you to notice one certain part of the sign right there in the middle, you could die out here. So if it happens that you are inspired in some way or another to ever visit these incredible places, as the sign says, be prepared. Though beautiful and inviting, the monument can be dangerous and unforgiving. Let someone know of your plans. Drink a minimum of a gallon of water per person per day, especially in summer. Wear a hat and use sunscreen, and cell phones do not work in most parts of the monument. You're sort of out in the middle of nowhere. So Lick Wash is this remarkably beautiful wash. In fact, it kind of, in some ways, reminds me of Antelope Canyon. And you can see how it narrows here. And there's Vicky, actually. When we did this, so during spring break, it was actually very cold. The temperature was in the 20s when we got started on this hike. In the summer, of course, it can be well up into the hundreds. But it was so cold that the water was frozen in little pools, and I took a whole bunch of photographs, and I'll only show you this one, but I just thought they were like these beautiful abstracts of the rocks and then the patterns of the ice, the water frozen between the rocks. So, there were little things and there were big things. Part of Grand Staircase Escalante includes Grosvenor Arch. So you can see these huge arches and an area known as the Toadstools, these odd-looking rock formations. Then on to Bears Ears National Monument. And if you look right in the center of the photograph, you can see the Bears Ears, those two little promontories coming up out of the landscape. There are a couple of quotes here, and again, I'll read them to you so that you don't think your audio is all of a sudden died on you. Mary Ellen Hannibal wrote, "The bear in question is submerged in the landscape, rising from or sinking into it. The bear and the earth are not separate, but mutually constructed. Both the naming of this place and the philosophy it represents come from the indigenous people who have lived here for millennia." So the point that's being made here is that Bears Ears is symbolic, and it represents a place and philosophy of the indigenous people. We will come back to this quote at the very end of this week's presentation. So that this is going to come up again, the notion of whether or not the bear is rising from or sinking into the landscape. So that will be coming in toward the conclusion. What you can expect to see within Bears Ears, again, are some of the most remarkable cultural remains that can be found anywhere in the country and perhaps anywhere on the planet. This is one of the places that we visited, and it's called the House on Fire ruin. If you look up from the cliff dwellings, certain times of day, the sunlight reflects off the canyon walls in such a way that those appear to be flames coming up off the cliff dwellings themselves. Now, as you recall, Bears Ears was initially set aside by President Obama in 2016. And so this was right as his administration was ending and a new administration was coming in. Once the new administration came in, there was initially no progress, no management progress on that original proclamation. And so you'll see here, there was no monument manager, no additional rangers, no plans for a visitor center, no Bears Ears National Monument signs were ever put up. Monument maps were destroyed by the new administration, and visitation has skyrocketed. And so this creates an extraordinary situation where you don't have a monument manager or any additional rangers, a visitor center that might help educate and interpret to visitors, no signs, and the original maps were destroyed because the boundaries were so substantially reduced. So Vicki and I actually went to a public meeting. This was March 27th, 2018, at the Bluff Community Center, where incidentally I used to live when I was the San Juan River Ranger back in the day. And the idea of the public meeting was to collect input, well, from the public. And the issues that were looked at, again, you may recall from early on in our course, that multiple use has to do with things other than recreation. Recreation is a piece of it, but there are many other pieces as well. This would include travel management, grazing, woodlands, mineral extraction, recreation, of course, and cultural resources. So again, this was in Bluff, Utah, and the Bluff, Utah is an incredibly small town. It was when I lived there, and it still is, but a lot of people came from all over to learn more and to provide their input in different sections according to woodlands, recreation, mineral extraction, grazing, and so on. And there were opportunities then for the public to provide their input, written comments, and verbal comments. So here you sort of see democracy in action. But what happened is that the administration is moving quickly to promote the extraction activities. That would be the uranium, the coal, the oil, and so on. And it has been noted that the urgency is unprecedented. There are other negative effects to take into consideration, to include human health issues that often accompany the development of extractive industries such as coal and uranium. Then, as I already alluded to, fossil fuel development contributes to global climate change, when ideally we would be looking at clean energy alternatives. And the White House's Environmental Protection Agency is eliminating regulations to curb pollution, which of course only exacerbates climate change. So you can see that I was able to go out, investigate all of this on the ground, and then, as I said, just a month later, I was in France with the opportunity to report on conservation issues in America, because in a very real sense, what's going on in the United States is going to have an influence on how other countries continue or discontinue protecting their own natural landscapes. We will turn next to the conclusion of this lesson on Bears Ears.